Welcome to this APUSH quick review for period 8, the period from 1945 to 1980, in which I'll attempt to cover the highlights and main themes of this period in just 4 slides. Big theme of period 8 is definitely the Cold War, which can be traced to a big ideological gap between the Soviets and the United States, the US preferring capitalism, the US valuing freedom and liberty, versus the perceived authoritarianism and communism as being completely antithetical to US interests and US values. So these ideological differences are at the core of why the US can't let the Soviets win or expand. And that means the United States will attempt to contain the communists. Kennan's recommendation for containment, meaning the US will not allow the expansion of any Soviet ideology or influence in Korea, which gets us in the Korean War, Vietnam, so North versus South Vietnam, the Middle East, can't let the oil be communist, or indeed in Europe, using the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe after World War II to prevent the spread of communism there. We could add Greece and Turkey to that list with the Truman Doctrine. And we'll see later under other presidents that that would include South America as well. Can't let the commies go anywhere. If they expand, the US loses. The US way loses. The American way loses. The United States is part of a transition as well in this time period where former colonies, former imperialized locations are decolonizing. And these places are leaving the colonial powers that once controlled them, often by force. And then the United States is having to compete for influence in those locations. They get labeled third world countries. Often third world implies poor, undeveloped, which is very often the case because of how they were treated under imperialism. But they are often resource rich, or in the war on communism, we just simply can't allow them to become communist. As in the case of Vietnam, once under French control, after 1954, cannot allow that place to become communist because, like a series of dominoes, communism will just spread all over Southeast Asia if we do not protect Vietnam from the Red Menace. The Cold War also leads to a technological fight between the United States and the Soviet Union through atomic energy, nuclear energy. So we get into an arms race, which leads to brinkmanship and a considerable amount of fear that the world might be destroyed in radioactive and atomic destruction. That fear spreads also to space, as in the space race launched by Sputnik, as both sides attempt to dominate militarily through these massively powerful weapons. There are periods, though, in which the United States and the Soviet Union managed to mutually coexist somewhat peacefully. But then often, of course, something will derail that coexistence. So late 50s, for example, there's some thawing of the Cold War up until the U-2 spy plane incident. Another great example of this sort of thawing, this mutual coexistence, comes under President Nixon with a policy of détente, as the United States is trying to work out some of its differences with China. So Nixon travels to China. We have the signing of treaties like SALT I, like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, that indicate that we are drawing back from this intense desire to dominate, even to the point of nuclear destruction, only to see that go away and then ramp back up again under other presidents in the future. The effect of the Cold War at home is a rather chilling one, pun intended, in which we see the use of smears, lies, dishonesty in order to shut down people who are deemed different, people who are deemed security risks and threats to the American way. The general label for this is McCarthyism, but it's bigger than just Joseph McCarthy. He just happens to be the more ugly and nasty face of this shutting down of difference. We see it under President Truman, his loyalty board, when they fire alcoholics, gamblers, and homosexuals as security risks. We'll see it in labeling the civil rights movement as communist. So anything that breaks the conformity of this time period is seen as a threat to the American way and will be deemed communist and therefore dangerous. There is also pushback, though, as Americans increasingly do not see that the wars the United States is getting involved in are serving American interests. So, for example, anti-war protests during the 1960s. Why are we in Vietnam? Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? These kinds of protests, the burning of draft cards, indicate that the public is not always willing to accept this war on communism as a necessary and essential part of the American mission in the world. And we also see some concerns from presidents themselves. For example, Eisenhower's farewell address, noting that the linkage between business interests and the military can get so strong that perhaps it might push us into conflict, a phenomenon he labeled the military-industrial complex. A second theme of the period 8 timeframe is the growing civil rights movement. African Americans, inspired by their commitment to double V during World War II, launch movements for legal equality, social equality, economic equality. They do not agree on strategies, methods, but they utilize a number of approaches to pushing the American public to granting more equality for African Americans. There's a legal phase, sort of represented by Brown versus Board, for example, where the use of the courts and the presidency to support civil rights, such as Eisenhower sending troops to enforce integration at Little Rock. That's followed by and complemented by a nonviolent resistance movement by Martin Luther King Jr. and others who use boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. None of this is really new. This we saw with protests in the Harlem Renaissance, as well as CORE being founded in 1942. But generally, the goal is to use these nonviolent tactics in order to put pressure on people to change their segregationist policies. And so we'll see this in the Greensboro sit-ins. We'll see this in the March in Selma. We'll see this with the Montgomery bus boycott. There is also a growing sense in which African Americans need to take ownership of the movement and obtain their equality and their freedom on their own. And we see this more in violent means and aggressive means or militant means in the civil rights movement in the early 60s. Self-defense, self-help, and even some forms of violence show the frustration at the slow pace of change. Even Martin Luther King Jr. criticized the slow pace when he said the word wait almost meant never. These self-defense mechanisms, these self-help mechanisms, do divide the movement, and they sometimes alienate white supporters who wonder why African Americans want to go alone, who are bothered by the very militant talk of people like Stokely Carmichael, or the Black Panthers, or Malcolm X. The African American civil rights movement inspires other movements for equality and encourages those movements. So second wave feminism, women trying to figure out, is there more to life than, you know, this 50s cult of domesticity? How can they change gendered assumptions about women's inferiority? The movement for gay liberation, Stonewall, the decriminalization and destigmatization of homosexuality, Hispanic activism such as LULAC, La Raza, the American Indian movement in portraying the past as a series of broken promises to Native peoples, the occupation of Alcatraz, the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices. Even Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, inspired by the promise of equality that their parents weren't living up to. You know, mom and dad were liberals of the Truman era, but really weren't actually truly interested in real equality and real democracy. And these young folks in the 60s are saying, what can we do to make America a more participatory society? The most popular of all the movements is environmental rights. Notice it's the one that doesn't directly have an effect on, you know, a specific group of people, because we can all talk about loving the earth, whereas it's more controversial when it involves people versus another group of people. So we'll see by the late 60s, early 70s, growing influence of environmentalism. Even President Nixon will get in on this with the creation of the EPA. Congress will pass the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. So it becomes popular to love your planet. Theme 3 is the decline of liberalism. The liberal idea, or so-called New Deal consensus, is that the government, the federal government in particular, can address and tackle problems. It can solve social ills. Government, in the words of one historian, was good. LBJ does this under his Great Society when he tries to declare war on poverty and tackle the question of inequality, economic inequality. And he is successful at lowering the rate, but there are problems that still linger. Many younger people in the 60s start to question liberalism's promises. And they question it lots of different ways. They wonder if mom and dad are not truly liberal enough. Maybe mom and dad only give lip service to equality or lip service to a better world where government is good. The liberalism of the era also affects Supreme Court decisions, where the Supreme Court is expanding rights to the accused in the courtroom. They're declaring that forcing kids to pray in school is unconstitutional. They're addressing birth control and abortion or reproductive rights. And these decisions will become milestones in the birth of a rising conservative movement who wonder why the court is suddenly granting new rights to all of these people who they think don't deserve them. Increasingly, liberals and conservatives will clash over morality and how to address moral questions in the public. They'll clash over racism. Should we solve this at the federal or the state level? What power should the federal government have? Should we, allow these rights movements to continue to push for equality, or should we tell, these people to sit down and be quiet? How should we deal with communism around the world? Should we move for mutual peaceful coexistence, or should we be more aggressive and just crush those commies? The new conservative movement will be joined by a Christian right-wing movement. Christians who think that they should be politically active, they should be involved in the political system, and they should take America back to an idealized past where everything was godly and protected according to the way they think it should be protected. They do invent a past in order to make this happen, so they have an idealized version of a world that never really existed, as they want to take America back to those good old days. So you'll see small government, Christian nation, Christian nationalism all get tied together in this new conservative movement. There is a declining confidence in America's good government in general. Can government really solve all our problems? Can the federal government actually rescue us in a New Deal or a Great Society from our economic woes? And scandals in the federal government. Scandals, for example, Vietnam, the revelation that the government had been lying. Scandals in Watergate, Nixon and his dishonesty with the public about Watergate undermine people's confidence in the federal government. Polls show continued declining rates of trust in the government. So the belief that government is good and can actually do things to solve America's problems will start to slip pretty precipitously by the late 60s. The fourth theme of Period 8 is economic change. It is America's almost golden age economically, as the United States pumps tons of money into the economy. GI Bill pumps money in, Cold War spending pumps money in. The baby boom creates a whole new generation of consumers. Those 3.5 children in every household all need stuff and they need schools. Technological innovation. This is the era that sees advancements in telecommunications, the earliest stages of the internet. All of those things will create a really rapidly expanding economy that is increasingly segregated. The rise of the suburban world will create enclaves of whiteness, chocolate cities, vanilla suburbs, where the suburbs are built around a culture of abundance, the credit card in 1950, Levittown has all that you want, where you can achieve the good life. The United States of the 1960s will also see changes in its immigration policies. The ending of the quota system in 1965 will bring more people in from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, but it will also trigger xenophobic backlash as conservatives wonder why these people are coming to take our jobs. Why aren't they learning American culture? Why aren't they assimilating? Why aren't they speaking English? But there is a problem. By the 1970s, we'll see that this golden age economy will start to slip and fall as industrial production goes down and more Americans are involved in service sector work. So they provide services, financial services, for example. This will lead to a stagnant economy, stagflation, high prices, unemployment, low economic growth. People will start to move. Economy is bad, people migrate. And the big migration will be to the Sun Belt, made livable by the invention and the spread of air conditioning, which will increase Republican voting power in the South, Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Our last economic problem will come in the form of energy problems. Crises in the Middle East, the response of OPEC to America's involvement in Israel and Middle Eastern politics will lead to crisis in terms of obtaining oil for our cars that don't get very good gas mileage. So we start to have debates about energy independence. Can we find new sources of energy? Can we reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern oil? That will add to the hurt of the 1970s, none of which will get resolved until about 1983. That's been our look at period 8. So our 4 themes: Cold War, civil rights, the decline of the liberal sort of New Deal consensus, and massive economic change from a great and wonderful middle-class world to stagflation by the 1970s.